My sister and I have always been close. When we moved out after college, we stayed in roughly the same area, so we made a point of visiting often. Until 2019 anyway, because she moved several hours north for a new job. I promised I would drive up to see her and her new place as soon as I could, but the pandemic hit and I had to delay my trip for about a year and a half. When I was finally able to go, I was so excited. I was looking forward to seeing my sister and getting some peace and quiet. 2 days before I was supposed to go, Janet called me and she seemed, I don't know, a little off. She teased me about little things like remembering to pack my toothbrush and extra socks, but she sounded kind of nervous. Then she told me that it was very important that I get an early start so I would get there before dark. I brushed it off because she's always made fun of me for being a late riser. But then she repeated it and said it was serious because the road to her house always gets dark super fast. She even made me promise that I would leave early to get there before sundown. I didn't see why it was such a big deal because I drive home from work at night all the time, but I figured she was just being a typical overprotective big sister, so I promised. We said goodbye and hung up. Fast forward to the day of the trip. I set my alarm early, but it didn't go off, so I overslept and had to start way later than I wanted. I felt bad because I'd promised, but it wasn't really my fault anyway, so oh well, right? At first, nothing out of the ordinary happened, but once I left the city and started on that long stretch of highway that cuts through the middle of nowhere, some weird stuff started happening. I'd look at the time and then I'd blink, and it would be like 30 minutes later, or my radio would cut out suddenly or switch channels on its own. The longer I drove, the more frequent the weird stuff became. It started off slow but ramped up to something happening every couple minutes. And then the sun set. Okay, I thought Janet was over-exaggerating when she told me about this, and you probably think I'm over-exaggerating now. But I swear it was practically instantaneous. 1 minute it was sunshine, and the next I could barely see in front of me, even with the headlights on. It was like the night just slammed down on my car. I must have gotten confused at some point, because I somehow found myself driving down a narrow side road away from the main highway that I was supposed to take. It cut right through the surrounding woods, and the trees were practically touching the sides of my car. I thought about trying to turn around, but I quickly realized it wasn't possible. I checked my GPS app and saw that if I just kept going for a couple more miles, there would be a spot where I could merge back onto the main road. As I drove, I started getting this really creepy feeling like I was being watched. I told myself that I was just tired and spooked from the long drive. I mean, I was in the middle of nowhere at night. Nobody was out here but me, right? I managed to calm myself down, but barely a minute passed before I heard the most terrifying sound ever. It was a high-pitched shriek, and I thought it was an animal, but somehow it sounded eerily human. It startled me so bad that I automatically pressed the gas a little harder. Everything happened so fast. First I felt the car dip, then there was a loud bang. Then I jerked the steering wheel hard to the right to get away from the noise, but the car just sort of dragged. I took my foot off the gas. My heart was beating so fast I thought I'd die. It took me a second to calm down enough to realize that I'd probably just blown a tire. According to GPS, I was really close to the highway. I called Janet to let her know what had happened. She said she'd pick me up, but she sounded very worried. She said to walk the rest of the road to the highway and don't hang up. I was nervous about traveling alone and on foot, but it was a short walk, and I was still on the phone with Janet, so I felt a little better. I had almost reached the edge of the trees when this awful stench hit my nose. It was definitely something rotten and decaying. I don't know what death smells like, but I'm sure this must be it. Then it happened. A blood-curdling shriek, just like before, but closer this time. Much, much closer. And it sounded like it was directly behind me. I turned around and I swear that for a second I saw a pair of glowing red dots like eyes, but they disappeared behind the trees. I freaked out and started sprinting for the highway. I don't know why, but somehow I was certain that something was pursuing me, and that it was just letting me go because it wanted to. There were no more screams, but that horrible smell stayed. After that, it was a blur. I just remember vague flashes, reaching the highway, getting in Janet's car, walking in her front door. I don't think either of us said more than a couple words. The next morning, everything was weirdly normal. Janet was oddly chipper and gushed about being so glad to see me. My car was even parked in her driveway with all 4 tires intact. I tried to talk to her about what happened last night, but she just kept saying vague stuff about how it must have been a tiring drive and how she always had weird dreams after a long trip. Maybe it was just a weird dream. Janet and I had a great time catching up and swimming in the nearby lake. Everything was perfect until it was time for me to go home. I hadn't gone into my car since I got to Janet's place, and when I opened my car door, I got hit full in the face by a horrible stench, rot and decay. It was the same horrible smell as that night in the woods. If the smell is real, then what else about that night is real? I don't even know if I want to find out. I'm Italian and live in Italy. I want to tell you about this wild experience I had in Ravello, Italy. Ravello is this cool village on the cliffs of Italy's Amalfi Coast. My name's Carlo, and I'm just a history professor from Rome, and I'm really into stories about my country. Every summer, I take a break to go somewhere and dig into some history. This time, Ravello was my choice because of its old buildings and great views. So I was walking around the place one evening. That night, as it usually happens, when the sun went down, the streets get lit by lanterns. The shadows got all long, and although beautiful, were also a bit creepy. And I could smell flowers blooming and hear the sea not too far away. Then, out of nowhere, everything suddenly went silent. It was like the whole town stopped breathing or something. Right then, I heard this weird noise, kind of like wings flapping in the wind. The silence got even more intense, except for that flapping sound. So, naturally, I got curious and decided to check it out. I followed the sound and ended up at this old, run-down cathedral that was just at the top of the hill, maybe a 5-minute walk. At first, I looked around but saw nothing. I knew this church welcomed visitors at any time, and so I went inside, hating how the wooden doors made this creaking sound that echoed all over. Once inside, I walked around slowly as my eyes got used to the dim light of just the candles, and I saw something I can't even begin to explain. It was off in a corner, and its movement caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a priest or other church worker, but at first I couldn't quite tell. What confused me was that it was tall, about 6 feet, but looked like a mix between a man and an animal. It had black feathers all over it, and these huge leather wings, like a bat's, were on its back. I wondered at first if it was some type of ancient cloak and that I was intruding on some unique ceremony. Let's just say that I wasn't a regular churchgoes, and so anything could have been the truth at that point. But anyway, the craziest part was its face, or rather, the lack of one. When this thing finally turned and looked toward me, I could tell that there were just 2 big red eyes glowing in the dark. Man, I was scared. My heart was beating like crazy, and I was sweating bullets. My legs felt like jelly, and I was just trying to make sense of what I was seeing. So there I was, still inside the cathedral, my heart pounding so loudly it sounded like drums. I was sweaty, my legs were wobbly, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. And all the while, that thing just kept staring at me with its glowing red eyes, not moving or making a sound. You know that feeling when you lock eyes with someone and there's like a connection? It was like that, but way more intense. I felt like it knew me somehow, and it gave me the creeps. Time just seemed to stop as we stared at each other. Finally, I got up the nerve to take a step back, even though every part of me was yelling to run away. But the creature didn't move. It just kept looking at me, and then it opened its wings. Man, they were even bigger and scarier than I first thought. The rustling sound they made filled the whole place, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of amazement and terror. Then, out of nowhere, it made this sound. I can't even describe it. It wasn't a growl or a roar, but something older, more unsettling. It bounced off the walls and hit me right in the chest. And then with one big flap, it flew up into the cathedral's roof, like up into the rafters, and was then gone. I couldn't see it at all anymore. It was like it knew of a secret exit up there. That was it for me. I turned and ran out of there as fast as I could, but somehow I could feel it watching me, and I even thought I heard the soft sound of its wings as it took off. I didn't stop running until I was back in the busy main section of Ravello, where I collapsed against a wall, trying to catch my breath. I was back in reality, but I couldn't shake what had just happened. The memory of that creature, its wings, and those glowing eyes was stuck in my head. I spent the rest of the night just trying to process it all. Even now, as I'm writing this down, I still feel terrified. It's just so unbelievable, so eerie. In the ensuing days, I found myself drawn back to the cathedral, back to the place of the encounter. I was driven by a strange fascination, a need to understand what I had witnessed. The creature was never there, despite stopping multiple times at different times of the day. Its existence marked only by the faint trace of an otherworldly presence. But maybe it was only me who felt that. The encounter changed me, in ways I can still hardly comprehend. My pursuit of history, of forgotten tales and mysteries, had led me too close to something I had wanted to see. Basically, I crossed paths with a creature of legends. From then on, every creak of a door, every rustle of feathers, every hint of a shadow brought me back to that night. The creature had vanished, but its memory loomed large for me. It was spring of 2014, and I was staying with friends in Salt Lake City for a few days. The weather was fantastic, the roads were clear, and it seemed like the perfect time to stretch my legs and head out on a solo overnight trip to see some great hiking trails. I had never hiked in Utah before, but I was excited to see some of its beautiful forests and trails and to just check out for a few days. I found that there are many websites that gave directions for good places to explore, and also some visual imagery books online that provided detailed accounts on certain trails for people who want to explore on their own. This saved me a lot of money and time by planning out the trails for myself. So I drove the 4-hour or so trip south to Dixie National Forest, found a beautiful spot to camp, and settled in. The beautiful rock formations made me think I might stay longer than I had intended. It was absolutely gorgeous. An hour or so later, I ventured out and found a nice trailhead with a little bit of everything: mountains with waterfalls, cliffs, small caves, and forest. I had my backpack ready with plenty of water and snacks, along with a camera and first aid kit. I had never hiked with so many beautiful things to look at. In fact, I was starting to feel overwhelmed on which trail I should take and wanted to be sure to see all the best stuff. There were not very many people out hiking yet, and after a few hours my mind started playing tricks on me. It seemed like there was always someone in the shadows of every corner. Was this my imagination, or was something else going on? Maybe I just really needed to relax and clear my head. Maybe this weirdness was just detoxing the real world out of my system. Anyway, I stayed alert and just walked forward. I didn't venture off the trails since I did not want to be careless in case there may have been bears or other wild animals lurking around. I was also thinking there might be snakes hiding off the trails, and I'm crazy, stupid scared of those. After about another hour of walking, the sun suddenly went down and it became very dark. I wasn't used to it getting so dark so fast, since that doesn't seem to happen where I live. And now I found myself where there were no lights anywhere, and I could barely see further than 30 or 40 feet ahead of me. Luckily, I had a headlamp in my pack, and I put it on to see where I was going. I didn't want to admit quite yet that I might not be heading in the direction I needed to be. It wasn't long until I started noticing that the trees around me looked very odd. Their bark looked unusual, and I started to think that they looked like figures swaying in the dark. Their branches also made strange sounds as if something was moving underneath them. My curiosity, okay, it was really fear, became too overwhelming, so I stopped to take photos of it all with my camera, telling myself it was a really cool photo opportunity. I set the delay on the camera and started taking pictures. I told myself, for documentation purposes. That's when I noticed just how quiet it really was around me. No birds, no crickets, not even the sound of trees blowing in the wind, even though I was clearly watching them move. At this point, I knew there was a good chance I may have been lost, so I wanted to keep looking for the trail markers, hoping to find something I knew. I didn't want to turn back because that was obviously not the right direction. I had packed my hiking sticks with me, so I pulled them out, figuring it would be easy if I just needed to jab something that looked dangerous or out of the ordinary. And right when I got them out and started walking with them, that's when I saw it. The thing was about 10 yards away, and he was staring directly at me, his eyes gleaming back in the reflection of my headlamp. He looked like a dog, with a dog head and dog eyes, but his body was massive compared to his head size. He was probably 7 feet tall and just loomed over everything around. I froze. My head was trying to figure out why this dog would be so big. And then all of a sudden, all of my senses kicked in, and I realized that I was in deep danger. I trembled uncontrollably and couldn't run. That thing was standing on 2 legs and started to walk towards me, slowly, which seems like a good thing, but the confidence in its slow, purposeful walk was the scariest thing I've ever seen. It was so surreal because it walked like a human while having mostly only dog features from the neck up. But then its arms were so long and his hands were like dog paws, and they were massive. I had to run. My brain knew that I had to run, but my legs weren't responding. I turned the headlamp towards the trail and headed as fast as I could down the trail, trying to find markers of any kind, basically hoping I was headed in the right direction. But the creature followed, and he was breathing heavily behind me, close enough for me to hear it. I was all too aware of his hot breath raging out of his mouth, and my head was pounding, and the blood rushing through it sounded like thunder in my ears. The creature's dog paws hitting the ground was loud too, loud enough that I could tell he was close to me. At one point I turned around to look and was dumbfounded to see that he was running only on his back legs, just like a human would run. And now I was able to see what he looked like in full view. His eyes were glowing and his mouth was dripping with saliva. His fur was moving as it ran, and then there was the smell. It was all terrifying. And then in what seemed like a split second, before I could do anything, he was right next to me, almost as if like magic, and he swatted at me, but I dodged away just in time before turning and continuing to run for my life. The thing's dog claws cut through my long-sleeve shirt and barely missed my skin. The thought of getting seriously injured or even killed ran through my mind. It was all too real at this point. I knew I had to get out of there fast before this thing got another chance at me, since he was obviously very fast, very smart, and very sneaky. I kept running as fast as my legs could move until the creature finally gave up chasing me. It just totally disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I knew it had given up, or basically decided to stop on its own, because it had already proved to be much faster than I could have ever run. And next, all I was aware of was that I could hear a dog barking in the distance. Was it the creature or someone's pet? Hopefully someone's pet. But the barking seemed to be getting further and further away with each passing second, so I couldn't figure it out. The truth is that the barking actually made me feel a little bit safer, thinking that maybe it was just a regular pet dog after all, but I still didn't know for sure, so I kept running, hoping to find someone who could help me. And then, just like that, I came across a trail marker that I had never seen before. I studied it for a second and then realized that it was taking me in the right direction. So from there on out, I pretty much just followed the markers and eventually made my way back to camp. I can't tell you how this encounter has completely changed my life. It's been over 7 years since this point, and I still won't solo camp or head out on the hiking trails alone. The fear of being alone is so strong for me now. I just hope that someday I can put this trauma behind me and get back to being myself. Even now, that creature runs through my head every time I go out on the trails with friends, and I truly feel like something bad is going to happen. That the thing is always there. Honestly, that encounter still haunts me to this day like some sort of unreal dream, but very real. I'm scared. I just don't know if I will ever be myself again. Some things can't be rationalized or explained. I understand that. I know when some things are more make-believe than factual, but I have to admit I found myself in one heck of a dilemma that summer night. I'm not one for ghost stories. My grandparents sure liked telling them when I was growing up, but they weren't for me. I liked reality, even as a kid. So that's what makes this encounter so difficult for me to express, because I cannot explain with certainty what all had happened. Being part of law enforcement, we are taught to think with logic and factually accurate information. And even though our town was a bit into folklore and all of that, we knew what was real and what wasn't. That's how it was to me then. Black and white, fact and fiction. I've mentioned I've heard stories about spooky things. So I was familiar with some of the crazy things people dreamed up, but I never gave them much weight. Anyhow, I was working one day. It was hot. It was the middle of summer. This particular day we had been called to help a lady. She said that some delinquents were harassing her and her kids. She said they'd been doing some awful things like throwing rocks at her kids in their house. One had even taken out one of her windows. The woman was furious, as one might imagine. She said that her kids had been playing in the backyard and that they had seen someone in the trees. She said that they were throwing rocks at her kids. So her kids do what kids do. Monkey see, monkey do. You know the saying. And her kids start throwing rocks. They think it's some fun game that they got going on. But one of the kids got a rock to the head. The woman thought her kid had a concussion. But they didn't. They were fine. But the problem was that they continued to do it, and someone else was teaching them to do it. This was many decades ago, so teaching your kids right from wrong was very straight and narrow. If I had that woman for a mother, I would have been scared to get the belt. You know what I mean? But the woman said she was wanting to get to the bottom of the behavior and hold the juveniles accountable for teaching her kids such awful behavior. I agreed with the woman. Something needed to be done. So, we went to the woman's home. Sure enough, one of her windows was busted out, and one of the kids was still walking around with a bandage wrapped all the way around their head. It was a bit unusual. The situation, sometimes I still think about it. Something just seemed off right off the bat, but what we discovered was much darker than some teenagers being knuckleheads. We interviewed the children and the mother. The mother just kept talking about how those kids needed to be punished, and where were their parents? Sometimes when someone is so worked up like that, the best thing to do is nod your head. Because nobody is going to change their mind. That's how my mother was too, and my sister. All of us in our family, really. When we have our minds made up, good luck. So then we start talking to the children. The oldest one stated that they were outside playing tag, and that someone had been throwing rocks, so they started throwing rocks back. They said it was to teach the other person a lesson at first, but that it eventually turned into a fun game. The middle child, the one with the bandage, had said that they'd been playing this game for a couple of weeks now. They hadn't seen the kid who was playing with them, but that they were starting to make good friends. The youngest, they had the most information. They said that the kid in the woods was more like a man, and that they could see their eyes in the trees, that they smelt awfully bad. But they then said, "Mama says we can't make fun of people for that." So we made friends. At this point, I'm starting to fear that the children are interacting with a town squatter. But I don't tell Mother anything. I didn't want to frighten her. I stayed several days at the house. But it wasn't until the fourth day that the rocks started to hit the house again. The woman was angry, and she started pacing around her house shouting all sorts of things. But I told her that she needed to keep it down so I could catch the perpetrator in the act. She did as much, but she didn't like it. I quietly made my way outside and my way out towards the back. Sure enough, rocks were flying past my head, so I had to keep ducking. Eventually, I found myself behind a big pile of firewood, and I just stayed behind that. Those rocks weren't stopping, so I had to start yelling at the person, but it didn't make much difference. Finally, I peeked my head around the side of the firewood, and I could see whoever it was hiding being the trees. It was a dark figure, and it smelled terrible, just like the child had said, and it looked as if it were watching me. The rocks finally stopped. I'm not sure if it was because they didn't have any more to throw, or if it was because it saw me looking at them. So I edged closer to the perpetrator. But it ran away. Fast. Before it did, I got a bit more of a look at it. And truth be told, that thing was covered in dark hair. Now, I told you I don't do ghost stories or anything like that, but I can't quite explain what was throwing those rocks. You hear these stories growing up and you think, that's not true. No way. But I'm realizing the world isn't as black and white as I thought. Maybe there are some gray areas in between. Hey there, I really think that my story is something wild, and you'll probably be able to make more sense of it than me. I live in a pretty rural town down in Kansas, and a few months ago I saw the strangest thing I've ever laid my eyes on. There was this one morning that I had to go to the DMV and get a new license. Mine had expired. I got up early, way earlier than normal, and overall it seemed like a typical morning. It was then on my drive to the DMV when I saw it. Halfway there, I'm driving through my rural town into the more metro area of where I live, and I notice that there is some huge thing in the sky nearly right above my car. At first, I freaked out. There was some flying object in the sky, and whatever it was descending to the ground and fast. I thought at first that it was a plane, and that stressed me out more than anything. Was it a terrorist attack? Was there some kind of internal malfunction? I wanted to call the police or something, but the fact is I sort of figured someone else already had. Besides, I was in shock and wasn't reacting properly. Anyway, whatever it was crashing. There was a stream of smoke coming out from behind it, clear as day. The odd thing was, as it came closer to the ground, closer into my field of vision, I realized it was definitely not a plane, or a helicopter, or anything I've seen in my life. So now I'm watching it way, way closer, because I want to see where the thing is going to drop. I know that curiosity killed the cat, but this seemed like something important, or at least abnormal enough to pay attention to. It was shaped like a CGI starship from a Marvel movie or something. It wasn't a flying saucer, but the way it was designed looked very foreign. It was gray, and for all intents and purposes, too large to go unnoticed, and too large to be in the sky for that matter. Eventually, after a short while, I see it descend closer and closer to the ground, nearby but definitely a few miles out. I figured, hey, I'm already late for my appointment. I should go see what the hell this is about. So now I'm speeding my way towards where I saw the thing crash. I was going quick as hell, and I got there in less than 10 minutes. I parked on the side of the road because it crashed in a kind of woodsy area I could only get to on foot. I can't lie, the adrenaline was high, and I was very excited to find this thing and figure out what the hell it was. Much to my dismay, though, when I got to the crash site, there was nothing there. I mean, there was a hole in the ground, but nothing else. It was just a massive, empty crater in the middle of the woods. I thought I was going crazy. I thought at first that I had imagined the entire thing. And then I tried to rationalize that I had found the wrong spot, that this wasn't really where it had landed. But I soon understood that neither of those things were the case. Nope. In actuality, the damn thing just disappeared. But I'll tell you this, it didn't disappear without a trace. I jumped down into the big hole at the crash site to have a look around, and to check that the ship wasn't like invisible or something, and believe it or not, I found some debris. Debris is vague, I know, but this was the really strange part. I collected all the weird rocks that were scattered at the base of the crater and shoved them in my pockets. I looked around but found nothing else strange, and so I skedaddled out of there ASAP and took off in my car. Right away I called my friend Tom, who's a rockhound and amateur geologist. He analyzed them and tested their densities and checked for Mohs hardness, or whatever, and tells me that the rocks I found were scraps of meteorites. That's right, rocks from the sky. Insane. You might not see how this is substantial, but the fact is that if what I saw was any other known aeronautical machine, there's no way in hell it would have been up in space like it was. There's no way it would have vanished, disappeared with almost no trace. Unless, of course, it was something much rarer than any old airplane. My personal theory is that the thing teleported, that it entered our atmosphere and crashed somehow. And then by using some kind of weird technology, it got teleported back to wherever it came from before anyone else could see it. I've been scratching my head, kind of going crazy about it, to be honest. Since then, I haven't seen anything strange, but that doesn't mean I haven't been on the lookout for it. I bought a huge telescope, and now I find myself frequenting some unsavory parts of the internet to try and make sense of everything I witnessed. Not a lot of people in my personal life believe me, so I'm hoping at least you will. Well, I'm a long-haul trucker covering all across the United States, from Maine to California and back again. I have a few routes that take me through mountains, deserts, and forests. Just about anywhere you can think of, I've driven through it. It's a solitary life out on the road, and I don't get to see my family and friends nearly as much as I'd like to. I sure miss them and try to call as often as I can, but the time zone changes and odd hours can make it difficult. So, like any good trucker, I find ways to entertain myself. In particular, I enjoy calling out on my CB radio. My handle is Big Blue, and I've made quite a few friends out on the road using this little radio. It broadcasts only in a short radius, about 20 miles if the connection is good, and only around 3 miles if there's a big mountain range or something in the way. Well, usually I can get a pretty good connection. There's usually always someone out there chattering about politics or reality TV or traffic jams. I like to chat with my fellow drivers about their lives and their kids and so on. It's not too tough to find something in common with them, and I always point out the police stops and road closures and weather conditions. I started noticing this phenomenon a while back, and I am just now piecing together what I believe could be interesting for you. Each time I'd drive through a little town in Oklahoma on my Midwestern route, I'd get odd sounds coming through my radio. The first time it sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Well, maybe nails on a chalkboard if the chalkboard was underwater and the nails were from a panther. I don't know. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. This town is called Wapanucka, and really there's not much going on there. They've got a pharmacy and a movie theater and a McDonald's, and that's about all. It used to be booming with some factory work, but I guess that business moved out and left the town pretty stranded. There's got to be only a couple hundred people living in the whole county, so the area is pretty desolate. The only special thing about this spot are these sounds that come through on the radio. I don't know why it seemed so special to me, only that I'd never heard anything like it. The second time I drove through, the sound changed. It was like a beeping noise or a dial-up telephone, and then it sounded like a woman singing. It only lasted for about 5 minutes as I drove through, and I was going about 60 miles an hour at that point. I thought maybe my radio was connecting to something like a local pop radio station, and that was crossing wires with a calculator. Next time I drove, though, the sound changed again. I slowed down this time and stopped for a sandwich so I could listen more closely. This time the sound was a terrible scream, like a girl screaming. I couldn't just chalk it up to coincidence or leave it alone. It was just too odd. I walked myself right up to the police station and kept persisting until they sent an officer out to take a listen. When I turned on my radio that time, all I heard was radio static. They all rolled their eyes and laughed at me, but I knew that this was real. When I got back in my truck alone, I heard it again. This time it was a scream that sounded like a song. I truly don't know. I drove all around that whole county trying to pinpoint where the sound was stemming from. When I got outside the borders of the town, my radio would get fuzzy and I'd start to hear the usual calls from the other truckers. I found myself following as the sound got louder and louder as I approached this empty factory. This was the place that I guess went out of business. Now, I don't know what's going on in there, but it's got to be something that the police know about, because as I approached those front gates, I spotted the same officer that went to listen to the radio with me parked right outside. I have no idea why he'd act like he didn't know where the sound was coming from, but he did lie right to my face. I don't want to get myself into any kind of trouble, so I figured I'd best stay away for a while. Better to not stick my nose in where it don't belong. When I drive through, I still turn my radio up, and each time I hear something new, sometimes screams, sometimes shrieks, sometimes whispering or beeping, or a combination of every sound imaginable. I don't know. I just don't know. Please get in touch if you have any idea what could be going on over there. I have a feeling those police over in Wapanucka must know more than they're letting on. I have an inkling it could be an alien situation or worse. I remember the wings. They were all our town talked about for a while, the wings and the fire. Our little community is particularly special. We're a small town just like every other small town. Our one benefit, if I had to pick one, is our proximity to the lake. It's beautiful. You'd know the one if I said it aloud. But I'm not telling this story to draw attention to me or even to the town itself. I just want to talk about wings. I need to talk about them. I thought it was just me seeing them at first. I imagine we all felt that way. Well, maybe not all of us, but it's hard to imagine that it started with me. I don't want to imagine that. At night, after the community quieted down and we all drifted off to sleep, the wings came. I remember hearing them before seeing them. It was a black dream or a dream I didn't remember. Either way, I woke up and the rhythmic beating of those wings was stuck in my head, hard and steady like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The sound didn't leave right away either. I carried it into my day like a migraine. Sometime after lunch, it disappeared. But the sound was back, haunting me when I woke the next morning. I kept it to myself. Whatever it was, I wasn't ready to welcome any sort of medical emergency into my life. That was the only explanation at the time. Then I saw them. Or I remembered seeing them for the very first time. On the third morning, I could recall the sight of those fur-covered wings. Something between a bat and a moth, I thought. It was some creature my nightmares were inventing. And although I had the vision of those wings finally in my mind, I still couldn't imagine the size of them. I couldn't visualize the creature alongside anything from the real world. It was still intangible, still unknown. And I guess that's why I was comfortable talking about it with my neighbor. She told me she'd seen them too. The wings, they'd come clearly to her for the last few nights. She didn't know what it meant either. She only knew that they scared her. We were surprised, I think, that something had imprinted on the both of us so strongly that our dreams became linked. Had something flown over the town? Had a movie come out recently with a great wicked bat? We tried to laugh it off and invent a story that made sense, but we weren't alone in our discovery. It was my neighbor and her neighbor, and theirs after them. All of us in the town had dreamt of these wings, and when we discovered that, all of us were frightened. It became real then, especially as the dreams intensified. Soon it wasn't just the sound or the shape that we could see. In my dreams, the entire creature was revealed to me. While I had expected a bat or some sort of prehistoric monstrosity, the real monster was somehow worse. It looked like a man. His body was covered in short brown fur, obscured by dark circular patterns that seemed to move when you stared at them. His eyes glowed a bright red. And the wings, of course, were his own. The dream never left us. Each night it was clearer. Each night more of the figure was illuminated. The monster grew so bright that eventually we could see what was casting that light as well. Great orange, licking flames. Flames the size of buildings. We knew by then that the creature was larger than us. We all had to look up just to meet its gaze. That meant the fires were historic in size, enough to engulf our town and all of the trees around us. But the longer it continued, the less we could do to try to cure ourselves of the vision, the rarer our conversations became. None of us wanted to admit the reason that we couldn't sleep. We just wanted to live our lives and forget the wings that were haunting us. Then, perhaps even faster than it had begun, the vision stopped. The town breathed a sigh of relief. We thought our nightmares were over, and for the first time in a long time, we enjoyed a day of peace. When the sun began to set, someone screamed. Fingers pointed at the sky, and we saw it. We saw the figure in our dreams flying over our rooftops. It cut in and out of the shadows. The dusk was hardly bright enough to frame it. Only red eyes were clear in the creeping darkness. It was there. It was real. We could all see it. But with it came the fire. And suddenly our very last concern was the monster we'd seen in the sky. The trees were ablaze. The sky was smoke. We were evacuated as quickly and as efficiently as we could. Not everyone made it out of our town. The fires came too fast and we were too disoriented. Some of us, I think, thought that we were only dreaming. We stood around as the fires closed in and thought that we'd wake up before we burned. Most of the town was saved. Firefighters from all over rose to the occasion and saved the pieces of our lives that hadn't yet been covered in soot. After that, things were supposed to return to normal. In most ways, they did. The fires were extinguished, and the dreams were gone. We were allowed to sleep again. But that didn't mean we'd forgotten. That didn't mean we didn't sometimes hear those wings on the wind. That didn't mean we couldn't see the fear lingering in the eyes of our neighbors. We became a quiet town. But now I think that was a mistake. I think the only way to escape those wings is if I finally talk about them. I'd like to just be honest here and tell you that I remember everything that happened that night. But the truth is that I'm still not exactly sure what happened. I'm from New Jersey and we go down to Wildwood, about an hour from me on the shore. Every summer I spend time on the beach and on the boardwalk, and usually we go towards the end of the season. Just past Labor Day, there are fewer and fewer people out there, and it's easier to find a spot to set up your towel. It's still sunny and pretty hot during the day, but at night it can get kind of chilly. It's not the nicest area, but the prices are pretty cheap, and it's easy to have fun since there is so much to do. Anyways, my friends and I decided to go in together in a motel room. There were 5 of us and only 2 double beds, so it was pretty crowded there. Somehow I got relegated to the pull-out couch, and that thing was super uncomfortable. The hotel was kind of sleazy and smelled like smoke and mold, but we're just trying to have a good time, you know. We were out hitting the beach bars and partying all day, so once we got back to the motel room, we were kind of wiped out. There wasn't much else to do, so everyone just wanted to head to bed so that we could get up early to hit the beach. We all laid down for bed at like 2 a.m., and I started to hear snoring from my friends like a minute later, but I just couldn't fall asleep. I was tossing and turning for like an hour when I decided I just needed to go for a walk. I put on my flip-flops and a sweatshirt and headed out the door. It was pretty chilly out, and the wind was kind of brutal once in a while. There was a full moon, so the whole place had an eerie feeling to it. You can't see the stars when you're in the town, so I decided I'd head towards the beach so I could get a better look. I was starting to sober up, but I wasn't completely sober at that point. I still know what I saw, though. I walked out of the motel and down the road for a bit. No one was out really, except drunk kids leaving the bars and some strange vagabonds on the road. Once I got onto the boardwalk, it got a bit livelier. There were some places still open, but I stuck with my plan of checking out the beach at night. I'd never been down there at night, and especially not by myself, so I was nervous, but definitely excited to stick my toes in the water. The thing about Wildwood is that the beach is really huge, and I don't mean width-wise. It's extremely long, and when you're walking to the water on a hot summer day, your feet will start to burn on the sand. Even during high tide, the walk can be like almost 10 minutes if you're carrying all your beach gear and shovels and umbrellas. But while I was walking at night, it felt like it was super quick. The wind was biting, but it was almost like I moved there in an instant. No one else was out at that point, so when I got to the water's edge, I was surprised to see a figure in the waves. The moon was shining down on the waves, and as they broke, the white caps would sparkle. About 30 feet away in the water, I could see the outline of a person. It was kind of a vague form, and there wasn't much light to go by. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight as I called over to them to make sure they were okay. They were standing in the water, but it didn't make sense because the water would be super deep, and it didn't even seem like they were struggling. The waves pulled back for a moment, and I realized that the person wasn't a person at all. The figure was really the tentacle of a squid or something. I don't know. I've never been a believer in krakens or sea monsters or nothing, but it raised another tentacle out of the water, and I could see the suckers on its arm. It started to slide towards me on the shore, so I took a step back on the beach. The thing rose a bit out of the water, and I could see a big hump that I think was its head or its body. Then it ducked back down into the waves, and all that was left was a splash. I really don't know what that thing was. I tried to tell my friends, and they thought I was crazy. They just don't get it. I know what I saw, and it was big. Ever since, I've been too scared to go into the ocean, and even pools get me a little nervous. If anyone has seen anything similar, I'd love to hear about it. Something happened to me, and I'm hoping someone out there can shed some light on it. I'm big into cycling and spend most of my free time training or competing in events. I live in central PA, and most of the competitive events in my area happen during the summer months, so I spend fall and winter staying in shape and getting in as much bike time as possible. My goal this day was to hit a 70-mile round trip in 5 hours. For some cyclists, that's almost a leisurely stroll, but I live in a mountainous area and am riding uphill for a good portion of that time. I left around 11 a.m. and planned to be back just before dark at around 5-ish. The first leg of my ride was pleasant, if a little cold. Despite a lot of sharp curves, there isn't much traffic in the area, so I don't have to be overly cautious of cars. The trouble came on my way back. It was around 2:30 p.m. when I turned around to make the trip home. I had lost some time as I had run into a few other cyclists I knew and spent a little time chatting with them. In passing, they had mentioned seeing some military vehicles, but I didn't really think much of it, though there weren't any military bases nearby. So riding a little harder than usual, I started home hoping to still reach my front door by 5 p.m. It didn't take long before I hit a literal roadblock. There was a deep green Humvee stretched across the narrow road and 3 men in forest camouflage standing around. 2 were holding what looked like assault rifles, and the third was sitting behind the wheel. I was told the road beyond was impassable due to a rock slide, and I would need to take an alternate route. Explaining that I could navigate through on my bike came to no avail, and that I was basically out of luck. I know that the military responding to such an insignificant incident was odd, but didn't really give it much thought, as all my attention was drawn to the fact that the only other route home I knew was going to take me 2 hours out of my way. Passes through the mountains are few and far between. So I turned back around and began my extended ride home. Calling it a road does it more justice than it deserves. It was a single-lane potholed nightmare, and I always avoided it for just that reason, but it's all I had. Going slower than normal because of the poor road conditions, I began making my way down it. After about 30 minutes, I was beginning to think that maybe it wasn't so bad. The road seemed to have been patched in a few places, and some of the lower hanging tree limbs had been trimmed. I was slowing down to take a drink of water from my bottle when I caught something from the corner of my eye. It was moving as fast as whatever it was. I thought maybe it was a deer or something, but it had more of a loping gait than a deer's prance. Not really concerned, I came to a full stop to try to get a better look. It was behind a thick patch of brush about 30 yards away. It was hard to make out any details, but it was covered in muddied brown fur. Thinking it might be a black bear, I started pedaling again, keeping my eyes on it. Bears nearly never attack people, but I figured it's best not to chance it. Then it stood up. Its head crested the 7-foot-high patch of bushes. An elongated muzzle, like a wolf, sat in front of a pair of narrow amber eyes. It opened its maw and let out an almost human-like scream. I took off down the road, pumping as fast as my legs would let me. I heard it crash through the forest undergrowth as it leapt out onto the road behind me. Despite being on an uneven road, I had to be going over 30 miles per hour, and it was keeping up with me. I could hear its padded footsteps coming from behind, and it let out another skin-crawling howl. I have never ridden so hard in my entire life. 10 minutes, then 15 minutes, then 20 minutes later, this thing was still behind me. If it wasn't for the pure adrenaline of terror, I would have collapsed already. Anytime I felt even the slightest urge to slow, the creature let out another feral scream, and my energy became renewed. At one point, I came to a sharp curve, and one of those blind spot mirrors was mounted along the roadside. It had been knocked out of place and was positioned so I could see what was behind me. It was running on all fours, fangs bared as globs of saliva flew back from its mouth. I glimpsed a foot with several dagger-like claws extending from it. Through the mirror, me and the beast made quick eye contact, and seeing its quarry's face, it let out another human howl and quickened its pace. I was nearing the point of exhaustion and knew that I couldn't keep the pace any longer. Involuntarily beginning to slow, I had mental flashes of being torn to shreds by the creature. Just as it started to catch up, a light appeared on the road ahead. I couldn't see the vehicle yet, but waved my arms frantically. As it got closer, I could see it was another military Humvee, and it began to slow. I heard one last howl behind me, and the creature disappeared into the forest alongside the road. The truck came to a stop just as I reached it, and several soldiers jumped out. They began questioning why I was there and how I'd gotten past the checkpoint. I explained there was no checkpoint and that I was just on my way home. One of the soldiers walked away talking into a radio, and the others began to question why I waved them down and why I was so obviously distraught. The story just flooded out of my mouth, and throughout, they continued giving each other looks, and one even took a few notes. When I was done, one of the soldiers told me that the rock slide in the area must have agitated the few bears around, and that's what I had seen. I tried explaining that was not the case at all, but he insisted that I had seen a bear. The man who walked away came back to confirm that no checkpoint was placed on the road, and they offered to give me a ride the rest of the way. I don't think I was really being given a choice and would have accepted anyway. They didn't say a word on the ride, and where they eventually left me off was a short distance from my house. I know without any doubt in my mind that it wasn't a bear. Whatever that thing was, you can't find it in a zoo, that's for sure. Has anybody else seen anything like this? I've lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for quite some time now. Charlotte is a beautiful city with so much to do. We don't live far from the Panther Stadium, and I get season tickets to all the games through my work. The restaurants around here are some of the best in the world, and I can't imagine living anywhere else. I only have a half-hour commute to work, and life has been pretty good for us since we've relocated. When I look out my kitchen window, I can see this industrial building with no signage or advertising, and I've often pondered what could possibly be going on inside the building. At first, I figured it might be a food processing center or something like that. I can see cars coming 24 hours a day, and they park somewhere inside the building, so I never see people get in or out of their cars. There are a couple of things about this place that strike me as being weird. Firstly, all the cars that come and go are new and expensive. I don't think there is a single car in there that's 3 years old. Mercedes, BMW, Alfa Romeos, etc. Another distinct characteristic is that all the cars have completely blacked out windows, well above what I know to be the legal limit. I've often walked my dog Baxter in a continuous loop trying to figure out what is going on in there, but security is tight, and there is a large gate outside the building where the cars come and go. There is a sign on the gate that says, "Scan your ID at the gate," so there's no way I could just walk in there and figure out what's going on. Another thing that's been bothering me is the fact that the building is always so dark. I can never see inside, no matter what time of day or night it is. It's like the building is purposely trying to hide whatever is going on inside. And then there are the strange noises. Sometimes late at night, I can hear this loud humming noise coming from the building. It's like a motor running loudly, but I can't figure out what it could be. It's weird and unsettling. My daughter has claimed to hear anguished screaming coming in that direction, but to be fair, that could be coming from anywhere. There are lots of people living around us. Still, I wouldn't count out that the screams came from that building. I don't know what's going on inside that building, but there are some things that aren't right about it. I feel like there might be something illegal happening inside, and I worry about what could happen if I investigate further. But at the same time, I can't help but be curious about what's going on behind those blacked-out windows. My friends always think I'm being crazy, and when I mention the building, they roll their eyes at me. I know I talk about it a lot, but something weird is going on in there. I just know it. My neighbors all have varying opinions about what the facility could be. A couple have told me it's a drug processing plant. A few others speculate that it is a headquarters for a secret government organization. I was having some wine with a neighbor one night who confessed she believed it to be a front for a large-scale illegal weapons operation. My spouse jokes with me that it's a covert operations center for a major intelligence agency, but that has been one of the more plausible explanations I've heard. An older woman who lives nearby said it was an alien contact center where they're receiving instructions from outer space about how to invade the Earth. My daughter is convinced it's a center for human cloning or gene manipulation experiments. Besides the screams that she heard, she's also claimed to see strange men in lab coats escorting a non-human entity around the building. She says the windows of the building are blacked out so nobody can see the illegal tests and experiments they're running in there. Apparently, her friend on the school bus has a dad that works at that building and he's not allowed to talk about what goes on in there. Every time I think I'm being paranoid, I talk to my daughter and am relieved that I'm not the only one. My spouse won't entertain it and becomes incredibly irritated when I mention the building now. I guess I've talked about it too many times. I'm not the only one who views this building as something out of the ordinary. I was finally about to get a confession out of my landlord after a couple glasses of wine. He was visibly shaken as he recounted the story to me. I could see the terror in his eyes, and he kept looking around him to make sure nobody else was listening. He said that he saw a van pull up to the building one night and saw a man with a cloak over his head and his arms constrained behind his back fall out of the truck. The man got up and started running, and another man in a suit hit him over the head and threw him back in the van. The van disappeared into the building, and my landlord called 911. The operator said people were coming right away, but no police ever showed up. The landlord worries he is on some sort of government list now because of what he saw. He made me promise not to tell anyone, but how could you not tell people about a story like that? What horror is going on in that building so close to me and my family? Sometimes I feel like I'm going crazy. There are unexplained phenomena in this world, and if we don't keep investigating, we'll just live in fear and never know anything for certain. I like the idea that there are things in the world we can't explain. I think humans need to be humbled sometimes because we like to pretend that we know everything, which is why it's so weird that for years I forgot about a string of odd encounters I had as a child. It's funny the way our brains are wired. I hadn't thought about any of these encounters until I had a conversation with my brother recently. They weren't terrifying memories or anything like that, so I don't know why my brain pushed them to the back of my mind. Maybe I used to talk about my experiences more, but people always gave me funny looks, so I stopped. The first time I saw the little girl, I was somewhere between 7 and 9 years old. I can't remember exactly how old I was, but everything else about the occurrence is crystal clear. I was sleeping in my room when I woke up to a hand shaking my shoulder. A little girl around my age with light brown hair was standing next to my bed telling me to wake up. She was wearing a strange-looking sleeping gown. It was red with lace and puffy parts sewn in. She ran out of the room laughing. I was groggy from sleeping, and I assumed she was my older sister being a brat and waking me up early on the weekend. I stomped out of the room after her, but the hallway was empty. I went downstairs into the kitchen. My mom and sister were both standing at the counter watching pancakes cooking on the griddle. "Mom, Katie woke me up," I said. Katie is my sister. They both just looked at me in confusion. I then realized that my sister was wearing a white t-shirt and not a nightgown. I said, "When did you change?" Neither of them knew what was going on, and that made me even more irritated. My mom had to calm me down, and I explained what happened with the little girl in the red nightgown who woke me up. She told me it was just a dream. At the time, I thought she was right. A few months later, I saw her again. I think it was in late summer or early fall around Labor Day, because me and my family were heading to my uncle's house for a family cookout. We were all in the car ready to go, but my mom forgot to grab her purse. I was in the seat closest to the door, so she made me get out of the car to go get it. Of course, I made a big fuss about it because I was a pain in the butt as a child, still am according to my spouse. Her purse was upstairs in my parents' bedroom, so I went into the house to go grab it. I specifically remember running up the stairs on all fours like an animal because I was a kid, and kids are weird like that. As I rounded the corner to my parents' room, I heard someone humming. It wasn't a tune I knew. It just sounded like the mindless humming of a playing child. I was a little scared, but I poked my head around the doorframe to peek inside the room. The little girl was sitting on the floor with her back to me, rolling a small wooden ball back and forth between her hands. There was no mistaking her for my sister this time. I stood as still possible. I was afraid she would notice me. I saw my mom's purse on the dresser behind the little girl. I thought about making a dash for it, but she snapped her head in my direction and started to giggle. A giggling little girl in a nightgown should not be scary, but she didn't belong here, so I ran back to the car. I told my mom I couldn't find her purse. She scoffed and went to get it herself. I got an earful when she came back and told me it was right where she said it was. I think she could tell I was shaken up by something, so she stopped lecturing me when she saw my mind was a million miles away. I haven't thought about either of these strange occurrences, or hauntings if you want to call them that, for years. But 2 months ago I was talking to my brother over a few drinks, and he told me something that brought those memories crashing back. When he was younger, he would refuse to go upstairs by himself. We teased him about it and chalked it up to him being a scared little kid. We were rehashing old stories about him refusing to go upstairs as a child when he told me he didn't like going upstairs back then because he would always hear a little girl giggling and the sounds of small feet scampering around. He said his toys were always rearranged when he left them out in his room, like someone else came and played with them. Hearing this made my spine crawl. I felt some conflicting emotions. On one hand, I was a little upset to be reminded of the creepy occurrences from my childhood, but it also made me feel validated, because what I saw was not just a figment of my own imagination. Normally, I would have kept this story to just myself and a few close friends, but after talking to my brother and comparing our experiences, he convinced me to reach out to you. Maybe we are both just a little bit crazy, or maybe there are some things there that we just don't understand. I don't know why there would be any kind of spirit in my parents' house. It was built by them, so no one else has ever lived in it. I know it all used to be farmland before it became a suburban development. My only guess is she is somehow tied to the land, and to be honest, I'd rather not dig any deeper into it. I've been a park ranger in this park for nearly a decade. You might think being a ranger is all about enjoying Mother Nature's glory, and mostly you'd be right. But sometimes it's an entirely different story. This particular park isn't just any patch of land. It's a vast expanse of wild wilderness, remote and isolated. But to me, that's part of its charm. There was a fellow ranger, Hank, an older, rough around the edges but wise man. He'd been working these parts long before I arrived. Hank would often recount odd happenings, strange sightings, and the folklore of the park. I'd laugh it off, suggesting he'd spent too much time alone in the woods. Yet a part of me took his tales seriously. Call it intuition or a gut feeling, but I believed there was truth in his stories. This place is magnificent. But when you are miles from the nearest town, you can't help but feel vulnerable. Vulnerable to the unknown. When you're here, you learn to respect this place, not just for its beauty, but for its secrets. And as I was about to discover, some secrets are better left untouched. Little did I know, a lesson awaited me that would forever change my perception of this remote corner of the world. I was on a routine patrol, the quiet isolation of the trail my only company. I took a break in a spot I enjoyed for its tranquil beauty. That's when I first noticed a peculiar stillness. No birds singing, no leaves rustling, not even the soft babble of the creek. I had never experienced such an unsettling silence in all my years as a ranger. In this unnatural quiet, I spotted something odd near the tree line, a strange silhouette against the vibrant hues of fall. As I squinted to see better, I choked on my breath. I was looking at a figure, tall and stark white against the backdrop. Thin, almost skeletal, its limbs elongated, bending in ways unnatural to humans. It stood on all fours, its back arched. Its pallid skin was tightly stretched over its frame, with two large, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the wilderness. There was no discernible mouth, just those intense, unwavering eyes. Frozen, I watched as it slowly rose, its form silhouetted against the sinking sun, an eerie violation of natural order. Then it spoke in my voice, echoing through the wilderness, asking for help, pleading. It was my voice, but altered, like a warped recording. That's when I realized I was dealing with something very out of place. I ran, leaving the creature behind, my heartbeat drowning out all else. Some secrets are meant to remain hidden. Over the following weeks, sleep evaded me as the memory tormented me. Closing my eyes, I'd see that pale creature again, with my own voice haunting me. Unable to articulate my experience without sounding insane, I kept it all to myself, but it was all bottled up. One day, I discovered old records of similar sightings in the ranger station. Creatures that mimicked human forms and voices, dating back generations. They were known as shadow walkers, and the name itself was terrifying. Part of this land's history, they were believed to be ancient spirits, possibly predating the mountains themselves. They were shapeshifters, never perfectly mimicking sounds or forms, but getting very darn close. They were viewed as omens, and they were both feared and respected by the locals. Finally, I realized I wasn't going mad, albeit a horrifying revelation to learn what exists in the woods. From that day on, my duties as a ranger took on a new dimension. It wasn't just about protecting people from the wilderness or wild animals. It was about shielding them from something more hideous. My respect for the land deepened, and a vigilant eye was always kept on the unknown. I began to research more, delving into tribal histories and ancient folklore, consulting with local elders and historians. The more I learned, the more I understood the depth and complexity of these beings. They weren't merely creatures, they were manifestations of the land itself. My encounters with the shadow walkers became more frequent, almost as if they were testing me, recognizing my awareness of their presence. There were times I could hear them at night, mimicking the voices of my loved ones, attempting to lure me into the dark embrace of the wilderness. But I learned to recognize their imperfect mimicry. I followed the wisdom and warnings of the locals, and I never answered a call from the wild at night, always treating these encounters with a mixture of fear and reverence. I realized that being a park ranger was no longer just a job. It had become my calling. It was about being a guardian, not just of nature's beauty, but of its secrets and mysteries as well. My conversations with Hank took on a new meaning. What I once considered the old ranger's ramblings became wisdom, teachings that I now sought with a hunger for understanding. The years wore on, and the fear that initially gripped me evolved into a respectful fascination. The Shadow Walkers and I developed an unspoken understanding, a fragile truce based on mutual acknowledgement and respect. And as I walked the trails, patrolled the boundaries, and gazed at the untouched beauty surrounding me, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be, fulfilling a role that transcended just being a job. And in a place that was much more than a park, it was a realm where the natural and supernatural coexisted, a wilderness alive with history, myth, and magic. I have something absolutely terrifying to share. This happened 3 months ago behind my house in Kittanning, PA. I had a few friends over on a Saturday evening, and we were all hanging out in my backyard having a cornhole tournament. I recently got really into cornhole, and so did a few of my friends, so we play now every chance we get. I've spent so much money on different kinds of bags you wouldn't believe. Anyways, it was about 8 in the evening, and we had been playing for a few hours and having some drinks when we started hearing this really weird noise come from the back of my property. We were playing under the lights because I have a big old spotlight in my backyard so we can play late at night. Now I'm a hunter, and so are a lot of my friends, and we all hear this noise, and no one recognizes what it could be. I don't even know if I could describe it, but imagine a bullfrog mixed with a gorilla. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the best I can describe it. I know it doesn't make any sense, and we felt the same way, but we kept hearing it, so my one buddy, John, thought it was a good idea to go in the woods and see if we can find what is making this sound. There were 4 of us who decided to go looking, and I grabbed a spotlight and we set off into the woods. Now, when we were playing cornhole, it sounded like this thing was maybe 40 to 50 yards away as best as I could tell. We are in the woods about where I thought it was coming from, and now the sound is even further away. So we go in further and the sound is moving like it's either trying to get away or trying to bait us in for a trap. Well, it was certainly the latter, because what happens next is why we don't play cornhole at my house anymore. My friend John shouts out to the group, "Hey, look right there!" We see this thing because I don't know what to call it. This yellowish, hairless creature standing behind the trees with these claws wrapped around the front of the tree like it was hugging it. As soon as John said that, this thing jumps out from behind the tree and starts making these crazy sounds coming from the back of its throat. It had this rectangular head and very deep-set eyes that were glowing red. Its mouth looked like it had 3 or 4 rows of teeth. It looked like it could bite through an arm or a leg if it got a hold of it. Its veins were also bulging out all over its body. Gosh, just talking about it kind of makes me sick. It was pretty tall, maybe a foot taller than most of us, but it was kind of thin but muscular. My friend Will, who is always carrying, pulled out his 9mm and shot at it 3 times, but missed. It moved as soon as he reached for his weapon. It moved so fast like it could sense what was going to happen before it occurred. That was the last we saw it. It just took off after Will shot at it. Honestly, I'm at a loss on what to do. I didn't report anything to the police because I don't know what to say. We go to John's house now for cornhole, and we all carry all of the time. I was renting my house, but I've since found another place. I don't want to live where this thing was in my backyard. What on God's green earth could this have been? My friends think it escaped from some facility near my old place. There was this warehouse there that no one really knew what went on there. It's all fenced in too, out in the middle of nowhere, really. We didn't even know it existed until someone showed it to me on Google Maps. I don't know if they are running some crazy genetic experiments back there, or this thing came from another dimension or underground, but one thing is for sure, I don't want to run into it again. Unidentified aerial phenomena aren't exactly a new thing. I mean, they used to be called UFOs, and before that they were something else. We've basically been trying to find a name for them since we as humans could talk. None of the acronyms really do them justice, do they? Maybe that's because each title brings on a very specific image. UAPs remind us of obscure lights like the orbs over Arizona in 1997. UFOs remind us of the classic green men in a flying saucer, but that doesn't cover every variable. Those 2 sides of the Venn diagram don't encompass everything that we've seen. The sky is home to almost as many phenomena as the sea, and almost as many creatures. That's the UAP that I encountered. That's the one we were asked to identify, to follow, and to eliminate. Saying it made us nervous would be an understatement. One of the planes was being tailed by an unidentified aircraft. It started over the skies of Nevada and followed the plane east. It registered on radar, and the pilot caught glimpses of something massive diving above and below the clouds. The pilot described it as too mobile to be any type of human craft. He couldn't make out the details through the density of the atmosphere, but he could tell that its movements were too agile to be man-made. There are protocols for that type of encounter. Believe it or not, they happen quite frequently. Most times, the danger posed by the mysterious craft quickly dissipates. We weren't that lucky this time. Then again, we weren't exactly dealing with an aircraft. Suddenly, the unidentified object increased its pace. It cut ahead of the plane and jumped below the clouds. For a split second, it was visible in its entirety to the pilot and to the recording instruments within the cockpit. The findings were unanimous. It wasn't an aircraft. It was alive. It was a creature of some kind, as large as a 747, structurally similar to an eagle, except in the places where its feathers were missing and its leathery flesh was visible beneath. The turbulence caused by its erratic flight pattern was strong enough to throw the plane off course. They landed safely. That's when I was contacted. Myself and a group of pilots were sent up in F-16S to attempt a pursuit of the creature. We scoured the area, searched as thoroughly as we could, but returned to base empty-handed. All we had were the original readings and the pilot's description of what he saw. That was enough to keep us interested, especially as other reports trickled in from civilians. Fortunately, the creature was always too far away to be vividly captured on film. We used those reports to track its flight path. We spent months trying to predict its behaviors, so that when it turned up, we'd be waiting. Whether or not the creature had any cruel intentions at heart is obviously up for debate, but its existence was enough of a threat to our security that something had to be done. At the time, I wasn't the type to ask a lot of questions. I liked having orders. Orders made things easy. Of course, we didn't expect that the beast would come for us. We woke up to alarms. Training and adrenaline filled in the gaps where fear would have left us vulnerable. The base was fully alert and capable of violently defending itself within minutes. We were expecting an airstrike. We were watching the gray skies overhead, waiting for the clouds to explode. Our anti-aircraft operators were screaming with chatter, unsure of whether or not to act on what they were seeing. It took the rest of us a moment to catch on. We didn't know what it was until it was on top of us. Even the few there who had actively been pursuing the creature didn't expect to see it like this. It descended through the clouds and blacked out the sky behind it. It seemed to spread its wings from horizon to horizon. It was easy to imagine the giant bird spreading its giant maw and plucking us all from the ground. The anti-aircraft missiles kept that from happening. Small explosions rippled against its body, sending shock waves through its feathers and through the musculature below. It let out a screech that shattered every pane of glass on the base. Then it pulled upright and flew away. We wanted to run it down. Our own vehicles were suddenly inoperable. We were stuck there with no choice but to watch it depart, knowing that our best defenses had only tickled the great creature. It had come down and warned us, we decided, and no one wanted to chase it anymore after that. We were scolded by our superiors. Of course we were. Blaming us was the only action they could take. We took our lashings and moved on. The incident at the base was described to the press as a routine drill. The papers ran whatever story they wanted to, most often suggesting that we had tested some top-secret weapon or vehicle. The sightings from around the base were easily explained away as weather phenomena. The creature was so big already that it was easy to imagine it was only a cloud, painted alive by just the right balance of wind and moonlight. Before we could resume the hunt, we were relieved to learn that the beast had been brought down by someone else. An international ally had spotted it over the ocean and sent the beast to the depths below. That was a better place for it than the dirt of the American Southwest. And now we have new protocols. There are new words in our lexicon and new orders that get issued when a UAP exhibits specific patterns. When it's alive, for instance, we don't pursue. We can't risk inviting something like the bird back to our military bases. So about 2 years ago, I had to move because I got a promotion and needed to switch cities. I moved from Chicago to San Francisco. I'm a single parent, so it was difficult already, but my kids had a hard time adjusting to the city. It was completely different. Money was tight, so I had to rent a small apartment, and the goal was to only be there for a few months, no longer than a year, until I could upgrade us to a better one. It wasn't much of a place, but it was good enough. There was a kitchen, a bathroom, and my kids shared a room while I slept on the couch. We were there for a few weeks when one of my kids began waking me up in the middle of the night because they were having nightmares. This was unusual, but I thought it was just stress. She would talk about a tall man who wouldn't let her sleep. Like I said, weird, but stress does things to kids. My oldest child was struggling to sleep too, but just said she didn't feel tired. I thought it was jet lag. A week or so later, I came home from work in the early afternoon. I get home before the kids do, so I try to make them their snacks. I was in the kitchen when I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me. There was nothing there, but I thought maybe I heard the neighbors. I turned on the stove and suddenly it was like I was shoved. My sleeve caught on fire, but thankfully I wasn't hurt. When my kids came home that day, my youngest was pale and shaky and had a fever. She spent the whole night screaming and yelling about the tall man. Throughout the night, things just got weirder. Doors opened on their own, plates were smashed on the ground, the apartment was icy cold and was filled with this awful stench like rotting meat. I decided to take my kid to the ER, and as we closed the door behind us, there was a lot of banging and rattling from inside the apartment. By the time we made it to the ER, my kid was fine, fell asleep in my arms. We made it back by early morning, and it was beyond trashed. Everything was broken. Pillows were torn to shreds, boxes emptied, dressers flipped over. It was awful. This was the start of the hell we would start to live in. Every night the house would be trashed. We just lived in constant filth. My youngest began to have behavioral issues that led to them being suspended for trying to attack another student. She became increasingly violent and had to be locked away at night, and my oldest had to sleep on the couch with me. I consulted behavioral experts and therapists for her, but nothing helped. As she grew more violent, so did the instances around the apartment. There were times I would wake up to a pillow pressed against my face, the burners on the stove turned on, or water running while the drains were clogged. After a year, I had enough, broke the lease, and moved us to a motel for a little while. Once again, my youngest became horribly ill and spent hours vomiting. She was sick for a few days, but once she was better, she was no longer violent. She was very calm and back to her normal self. But after a few weeks, it came back. Weird things happened around the motel. She became aggressive, and I began hearing and seeing things. I'm not crazy when I say this, but I would see a tall, dark figure out of the corner of my eyes. Sometimes it would just stand there, but other times it would seem to come at me. I began to have awful nightmares where I would see it. Often I would die and wake up sweating and shaky. My youngest began sleepwalking, and I'd often find her trying to leave or grabbing a knife or something. I began to do some research and seen that maybe we were being haunted by a ghost or a demon or some evil being, so I bought some crosses and put them up in the room. Every night they would fall to the ground no matter how they were put up. I'd rest it on a dresser and it would end up halfway across the room. Eventually I tried to contact a local church. Of course, whenever we got there, she was perfectly normal. They tried to ask her questions, splashed holy water, all kinds of stuff, but she didn't react in any way they wanted her to. We took them to the motel room, where they questioned her and seemed to try to provoke the evil in her once again, but nothing happened. They basically told me she was perfectly fine, but that they'd pray for her. They didn't think anything evil was haunting or attacking us. That night, everything was so much worse. Things were being thrown across the room, and my youngest attacked me while she was sleepwalking. She had this inhuman strength. It was like fighting a grown man. I called again and asked for help, but once again she acted normally. They didn't say anything, but it definitely felt like they thought I was lying. I've spent the past year moving around just to get a few weeks of sanity back. Fortunately, I was able to do my work remotely, but my kids are struggling in school. My youngest is always in trouble, and I'm afraid to even let her leave the house. It doesn't matter what I do. This thing always returns, and it won't go away. I can't keep doing this to my kids, and I want my child back. A few years ago, I was staying with a buddy in his huge farmhouse out in rural Texas. And when I say rural Texas, I really mean it. This place is out there. His place was massive and had a ton of land surrounding it. We were both writers, or should I say, aspiring writers. And it was the perfect place for both of us to lock ourselves away and get on with our novels. The views were amazing, which we hoped would be inspiring, and there were plenty of deer on the property just wandering around aimlessly. My buddy was pretty protective of them lately, mainly because a couple of times over the last week or so, we'd found one mauled at the edge of his land. Let me tell you, that's never pretty, and it upset him a lot. I mean, this guy loved doe, and it was just a large congregation of doe everywhere. He would constantly be setting out apples for them and salt licks. He was always sticking them around, hoping to draw them in. I think his plan was to pet one and probably befriend one. When it happened for the third time, despite it being what can happen often in nature, he decided to put down coyote traps as he assumed that was what was hurting his deer. Like I just explained, he became pretty obsessive and very possessive of his deer. Maybe it was a coincidence, but there wasn't another attack for a few weeks. So he was sure that the traps had driven away the coyotes. I mean, this was a good thing. But we had also seen a few fawns, and then he was beginning to get really anxious that they would be easy pickings if the coyotes returned. After all, fawns are pretty defenseless. He even took to sleeping downstairs with a shotgun next to the door so he could rush out and help if needed. I thought he was crazy, but then this story does get crazier because one night we both heard an unmistakable howl outside. Even as a writer, although we both pen crime drama, I would struggle to put into words exactly what it sounded like. So the term howl is the best that I can come up with. I think it is the single most terrifying noise I have ever experienced. I bolted down the stairs to find my buddy and the gun gone, the front door wide open. I threw on some boots since you never walk outside in Texas without boots and ran down to the traps. And that was when I saw it for the first time. Despite standing with a gun aimed right at it, my buddy was frozen. I mean, I can't say I blame him, for there in the trap was what I can only describe as a horrible wolf-like creature. Now I heard your audible gasp, your disbelief. Why on earth would I jump to that conclusion? Surely it was just a large coyote, or maybe a plain old wolf. Well, let me ask you this. Did you ever see a coyote stand on two legs just like a person and walk upright? No. Did you ever see one that had a long, skinny body and arms with hands resembling that of raccoons? Not paws and not human hands? I didn't think so. Have you ever seen one covered in hair so dark that it literally absorbed the light around it? And have you ever looked at something's face and thought, that looks like a wild dog, but with human eyes? I bet you haven't. Well, a thing with those descriptions was caught in the coyote trap. It was huge, taller than both me and my buddy, and we're both 6 feet, ballpark. This thing was mad, viscerally angry, veins popping, mouth frothing as it pulled violently against the trap. Shoot it, I whispered to my buddy, and he seemed to snap out of his trance. He raised his gun and fired off a shot. Normally he's a pretty good aim, but I think the fear overtook him so much, which led to unsteady hands and the shot went wide. What it did achieve, however, was to fire up this thing more. It gave another howl, although now being closer it almost sounded like a human scream, like the Incredible Hulk, and it ripped itself out of the trap. We were now the ones screaming and the gun was going off as my buddy was just shooting wildly at this thing, like he was playing Doom. I don't know how he could have missed every shot, but we'll never know because this creature, wolf thing, ran off and never came towards us and seemed to be more pissed at being caught than wanting to hurt us or retaliate. The deer, of course, had all fled due to all the commotion, and I'd felt like it took quite some time for them to feel brave enough or safe enough to come back and graze. We both stayed up all night those next few days, guns in hand, ready to shoot at the first sight of it coming again. Well, it never did. My buddy installs all sorts of expensive security equipment, cameras, etc., but nothing like that thing has ever been seen or heard on the property again. We will never know exactly what it was and if it was hurt or if there was more, but I will never forget seeing a human-like body with a dog's head and human eyes. It's by far the worst thing I've ever experienced, and I hope to God that I never see anything like it ever again. Something had been stealing from the park for weeks. Visitors were reporting belongings swiped from campsites. Members of the park service were losing personal items, things set down for just a second outside or left near an open window in the office. We always imagined that the culprit was human. We never entertained another possibility. Raccoons and magpies swipe little trinkets, sure, but not at a rate like our stuff was disappearing. We convinced our supervisors that a new security system was essential. Maybe we couldn't do anything about the campers losing their pots and pans, but we could at least secure the perimeter around the office. A date was set, roughly a week away, and we eagerly awaited the night that we would catch our thief in the act. We expected it was a squatter hiding somewhere in the park, avoiding our patrols and harassing our visitors. It was natural that we wanted them gone. But it didn't take us a week to discover the truth. It didn't take long at all for each of us to realize that what we were dealing with was far from natural. A loud metal grinding came from the parking lot one night. Something like a gunshot followed. We jumped to our feet and moved as quickly as we could. There were no visitors in the park, so no one was in danger, but the clamor was loud enough that we imagined the windows of our vehicles being smashed. It sounded like a sledgehammer had bounced off of the hood of someone's car. When we got there, that wasn't what we found. The vehicles were all in perfect order, but at the far end of the lot, where our industrial-grade dumpsters were placed, something had moved. Something had toppled. An entire steel dumpster had been yanked onto its side. Its open top was flush with the pavement now, spilling out the garbage we'd collected throughout the week. We exchanged reasonably confused looks. What could be large or strong enough to turn one of those things over? A group of us could barely push them around when they were on wheels. Then came the shriek. It pierced our skin and shook our organs. My entire body went cold. Looking between the rest of the rangers around me, I knew they were feeling the same way. We were ghost-faced and wide-eyed. Our lips were trembling and our brows were doused in sweat. It was a sound none of us had ever heard before. It wasn't a man yelling. It wasn't an animal call. It was deep and ominous. Then it came again. This time the sound sent us running. We scattered. A few of us ran toward their vehicles, recognizing them as the nearest forms of shelter. I hadn't brought my keys from the office. I headed that way instead. But I wasn't alone in my movement. As I started running, I heard the brush crunching under the weight of something massive. The branches were snapping in a rhythm even quicker than my own exhausted feet. I risked a glance to the side. Something was running all right. Something larger than me, standing on two legs, with shoulders as wide as any one of our cars. It was massive. The thick fur on its body made the details hard to decipher, but I knew that it was big. It was big enough to crush me if it wanted to. It was big enough to beat me to the office. I tucked my chin and double-timed it. I ran so fast that I thought my toes might burst through the front of my shoes. I thought I might run out of my skin. That's how fast I had to move. It was either move that fast, faster than ever before, or be caught by the giant thing in the woods. I slammed into the office door, and it swung on its hinges. My hip crashed into the first desk. I hadn't thought about stopping. The furniture made for good brakes. I whipped back around, ignoring the searing pain in my side, and slammed the door shut. I heard another shriek as I turned the lock and started to brace the frame with the desks and chairs. I moved a locker in front of a window, peeking just once to check if another ranger was approaching the office. They weren't. The rest of them had found their own pockets of safety, I guess. This one was mine. I watched through the narrow gaps in my barricades, looking for the beast outside. I caught another glimpse of it just once. Its back was turned to me, stalking toward the forest. It had come and gone that quickly, I realized. It was entirely indifferent to the rest of us, unconcerned with whether or not we'd escaped. Had I overreacted? I didn't want to find out. I stayed put and watched the hairy humanoid mass disappear into the shadows. After that, one by one, the rangers returned. I unblocked the door and invited them in. Only a few of them had gotten a glimpse of the creature, and none were as vivid as my own. Most of them explained what I already knew, that something about the animal's scream told us all to run. Maybe it wasn't hunting us, but it still could have destroyed us with ease. We tried to talk about the encounter, but our superiors buried the story before the newspapers could swarm our little park. They didn't want to invite that kind of eccentric tourism, I guess. I wanted to invite a hunter. I wanted someone to track the thing down and eradicate it so I could feel safe at work again. That never happened. But the creature never showed up again either. Maybe it knew about the cameras we'd installed. Maybe it had a close enough encounter with humankind to last itself a lifetime. All I know is that it went away, and the stealing stopped. We hear a lot of stories up in these woods, and I never believed them until this past year. See, I live in Bodette, Minnesota. It's up on the Canadian border near Lake of the Woods. There's a Pine Island State Forest just south of town and the Rainy River to the north. That's also the Canadian border. Because of the river, it's the walleye capital of the world, home of Willie the Walleye. Point is, there's not much up here except the town. I mean, you go south into Minnesota, and there's nothing until Red Lake. It's woods mostly. In winter, it's cold, like to the point where you have to plug in your car at night if you want it to start in the morning. I travel a lot by snowmobile in the winter. It's just easier. Baudette's got about 1,000 people, which is about 1,000 too many for me, so I got me a house on the edge of town. My buddy Derek lives even farther out, not even in the city limits. He's not even on city water. People say Derek's crazy, but me, I just think he sees things other people don't see, you know? He pays attention. He doesn't have a smartphone or any of that. He watches things in the woods. One day last winter, I went out to see him because my grandma said my deer meat was taking up too much room in her freezer. I figured I'd bring him some and we could have a couple of beers and talk maybe. I took the snowmobile because I can take a shortcut through the woods that way, and I don't have to worry about whether the county plowed Derek's street. I set out later than I meant to, because of course Grandma wanted me to shovel the walk first. It was December, and it got dark around 4 o'clock. When I finally got the meat loaded and got on the snowmobile, the trees were already making long shadows on the snow. I almost didn't go, but if I tried to go the next day, she'd do the same thing. I got on the snowmobile, put on my helmet, and hit that path through the woods. The light lit up the trail pretty good, but I still took it slow. You never know when a deer might run out in front of you, and that could be the end of you. So I was going pretty slow, just watching the trees go by, when something did jump out on the trail. Jump isn't the right word. That thing strolled. It was a good 20 or 30 feet in front of me, but my snowmobile light lit it up really good. Still, I couldn't believe what I saw. It must have been 9 feet tall. I mean, I could see it was as tall as one of the pine trees. At first, I thought it must be some kid messing around because nothing has antlers and stands on 2 feet. But this was no kid with a costume. It had a skull for a face. I got one look into those empty eye sockets, and I almost fell off the snowmobile. I never remember ever being that scared. But just when I was trying to decide if I should turn around or not, it disappeared. It didn't walk away. It was just gone. So of course I wondered if it had ever been there at all. Maybe I imagined it. I thought I saw it, but once it was gone, I had my doubts. I told myself it was a weird hallucination and kept going. But when I got to the spot where it was, I smelled something rotten, like when hamburger meat goes bad in the fridge, except worse. Much worse. It only lasted for a second though, so I just told myself I was imagining things again. I blew past that spot and kept going to Derek's house. Like I said, his house is basically in the woods. He's got a dish on the side for the TV and a bunch of wood piled up on the side for the fireplace. That's the only heat he's got, so I just leave my jacket on when I go inside. He just had me put the frozen deer outside in the snow before I went in. Once we had a couple beers, I told him what I saw. He said, "Yeah, that's the wendigo." Now I heard some stories about the wendigo, but I don't know what to believe, so I asked him. He said all he knew was it wandered around the woods, quiet as death. He saw it out his window sometimes, but it never came up to the house because he made a circle of salt around it. Salt keeps all kinds of evil away, he said. I figured it was worth a try. I was scared to go home after that because, of course, by the time I left, it was full dark. I didn't see anything on the way home, though. I did smell that rotten meat when I passed that spot, though. I tell you what, when I got home, I got out that rock salt I use on the sidewalk and made a circle all the way around the house. Nothing happened for a while, though, and I kind of forgot about the whole thing. Spring comes slow up here, but it finally did come, and when the snow melted, I forgot to do the salt again. One morning, I looked out the window and there was a dead rabbit there on the lawn. Like not just dead, but torn to pieces. And other people around town started saying they found the same thing. Rabbits, squirrels, even cats. I went out and did that salt circle around my house again. After that, I didn't find any more dead animals, but other people did. They tried to say it was wolves, but wolves don't do that. Wolves eat what they kill, they don't just tear it up. I know it was the wendigo. Derek says so too. I don't know how the last few winters were for you, but here in western Pennsylvania it was pretty crazy. Crazier than usual, which is saying a lot considering we're a state that gets hit with tons of snow every year. You better get used to snow if you're living out here. Another thing we have a lot of here in Pennsylvania is wildlife. Last winter I found tracks outside my barn, tracks I don't quite understand. They're clearly made from a canine, but no canine I know gets this big. They're pretty large in size, easily 12 inches if not bigger. We're talking huge canine tracks. Whatever made this had to have easily been the size of a grizzly bear, if not bigger. I know that doesn't even sound possible, but I cannot think for the life of me what dog breed can make these. The other thing that really bothers me is the track pattern is not quadrupedal, meaning it isn't from a four-legged animal. Judging by the way the stride is, it appears to be more bipedal. You can clearly see the stride pattern. It's like somebody was walking on two legs, walking around. And the other weird thing, wearing fake werewolf canted boots. The impression in the snow is quite deep, meaning that whatever made these tracks not only had tremendous stride, but must have weighed a considerable amount. I'm around 270 pounds, a bigger guy if you will, and I'm 6'2". Even me with all my snow gear on and my boots can't even make half the indent as these do. So something is out there doing this. I know of Dogman, and I've heard their legends all around the entire Great Lakes area from Wisconsin to Michigan and even all over western Pennsylvania. I've never seen one myself, but I've heard many stories from friends and family growing up. I never really wanted to believe they existed, but now I guess I have no choice but to second guess. The footprints actually come out of a small section of woods that back up 2 acres of national forest. The small section of woods kind of tails out down to around where my house is and where the neighborhood is. I would say from my barn to the small section of woods or tree line is maybe 100 yards, but I haven't actually measured. The tracks lead all the way from the tree line to my barn and then just seem to disappear. There are no traces of which direction it went. And I don't think it jumped on my roof considering my barn is roughly 20+ feet high. So I'm not really sure what to make of this. The tracks just literally disappear right as they go up against my barn. And it's the backside of the barn where there's no window, there's no door. I currently do not have any live animals, just old hay and old barn supplies. So I'm not sure if there was anything remotely interesting for whatever animal making this to get into. I don't know. I have far more questions than answers, and I'm hoping with your aid, you can help me answer many of them. Sometimes it's the little things that stick with you. Well, I wouldn't say this was a little thing, but it certainly started out that way. It was 1997, and I was working as a park ranger at the time, working in the Shenandoah National Park. I'd been there for about a year and loved it. The pay wasn't great, but the benefits were good, and I got to be outside all day, every day. That part of it was perfect. There were 2 other rangers on my shift, the day shift, at that time. We worked from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. with a 1-hour lunch break in the middle. My partner's name was Tim, and he was from the area, having grown up just down the road in Madison County. He knew this area like the back of his hand, and had been working as a park ranger for several years before I came along. I was still fairly new to the area though, so Tim would often give me little tidbits of information about where we patrolled each day or things he had learned over time while working there. One afternoon during our lunch break, he told me about some strange happenings that colleagues were talking about that had occurred at Bear Creek Lake State Park a few hours south of us. Tim said that he had heard stories from other rangers about strange sounds coming from the woods around the lake down there. He said that people thought it sounded like a woman screaming, but that it was much too loud and shrill to be human. He also said that he had heard some of the other rangers say that they thought it might be a Sasquatch or Bigfoot down there, but he didn't really believe in such things. I listened to Tim's story with interest, but I must admit I didn't put too much stock into what he was saying. After all, this was Virginia, and we're not exactly known for our Bigfoot sightings, at least not that I knew of. Besides, we were in the middle of a national forest and there were plenty of animals out there making strange noises. It could have been anything. I mean, bears certainly made plenty of noise when they screamed at each other during mating season, and deer could be pretty shrill when they watched over their fawns. So I simply filed Tim's story away in my mind and went back to work. Bear Creek was far enough anyway that I didn't worry about it. That afternoon we patrolled the north side of our area. We had a fairly large area to patrol, but it wasn't too bad since we could drive most of the time and only had to walk for a few minutes each hour. But it was during one of those walks that I first heard what could only be described as sounding like what we had talked about earlier, the Bear Creek Lake Screamer. We were walking along an old gravel road that led down to a small creek that fed into the lake. The trees were fairly thick here, and there was still some deadfall from recent storms littering the forest floor that we were heading out to check. I remember hearing something behind us as we walked down the road but didn't pay much attention because deer often moved through this area and sometimes even walked down this road. But then I heard it again. A loud cracking sound coming from somewhere in the woods just off the right side of the road, and then a screech. It sounded like someone stepping on a dry branch and breaking it and then screaming, but it was much too loud, and the sound was much deeper than normal. I looked at Tim, who had also heard the noise, and we both shrugged our shoulders. We couldn't really pinpoint what this one was. We kept walking down the road for a few minutes when suddenly there was another loud snapping sound from off to our right. This time I noticed that the sound seemed to come from a fairly large tree that stood about 20 feet off of the road and had grown to 40 feet in the air. The top branches were moving as if something had just jumped from them, down to the ground and moved away quickly. I looked at Tim again, who seemed just as surprised as me by what we saw, but neither of us said anything because we didn't know what it could be. I remember that my mind flashed back to Tim's story earlier in the day and wondered if maybe we had just encountered a Bigfoot. I kept that thought to myself, though, not wanting to scare Tim. Besides, we were still in the middle of a national forest and there were plenty of animals out there that could have made that noise. It could have been anything, right? Well, we eventually finished our patrol in that area without incident. But that afternoon we patrolled the south side of a assigned area, and as we drove down one of the roads there, I once again heard that same cracking sound coming from behind us. This time the cracking was much louder than before. Again, my mind flashed back to what we had seen earlier in the day, and I secretly wondered if this was another Bear Creek screamer. And then, sure enough, the screaming pierced through the air. It was shrill and loud and sounded just like a woman screaming. I looked over at Tim, who had a look on his face that I have never seen before. But all he could do was just shake his head, saying, "I don't know what that is." We both looked around for a while trying to find the source of the screams, but never did pinpoint anything. To be truthful, we only really half looked because I don't think either of us really wanted to find anything. And also, it was getting late in the day, and that was a great reason to head back to the main office. So we eventually gave up looking for whatever it was and didn't have to feel too guilty about it. I thought about those sounds for a long time, though, trying to work out in my mind what they could have been. And it didn't take me long to wonder if it could have been the Bigfoot Tim had talked about earlier. Like maybe it had traveled north and was now in our area. I mean, like I said, I didn't really believe in such things at first, but after hearing those screams, I'm not so sure anymore. Besides, Tim told me later on that he didn't want to admit this to anyone else because no one else believed in these things, and they tended to just laugh at him. But he said he had heard the screams before and knew what it was, that it was the same thing they had been hearing down south. Personally, I've never heard them again, but I do still remember that sound like it was just yesterday, and I find myself becoming more and more convinced that it was a Bigfoot after all. It's one of those little things that continues to stick with me. The gray dogs were always part of our lives. Growing up in the Southwest, you just accepted always hearing about them. They were just always there. You might get told by your parents to come in by a certain hour, otherwise the gray dogs might get you. You might find a wild animal who met an untimely end. You would hear that the gray dogs were always responsible. You might even see them. ducking behind rocks, hunting from behind the bramble. If you saw the gray dogs, you always headed for the other direction. The kids who didn't do that, well, it never turned out good for them. I wasn't one of those kids, the brave ones. Or maybe they were the stubborn ones. Depends on who you asked. I did know a few of those kids, though. Jalissa from 5th grade ran into the gray dogs. They terrorized her family's ranch for a while. I remember hearing about their livestock going missing and then turning up drained of blood. I remember the drawings of 3 dots arranged like the points of a triangle. They populated Jalissa's notebooks for weeks. She couldn't get the shape out of her head, I guess. Eventually, I forgot all about her and what happened to her family. She got quiet, then distant, then altogether disappeared. So did her family. They moved, I guess. I didn't really think more about it. The old folks said it was the dogs that drove them out. I think by then I was already rooted in my disbelief. You see, I wasn't going to break any of the rules and invite the wrath of the gray dogs into my life. But did I think they could be responsible for so many things? Did I think they could drain the blood of a cow or chase a family off their property? No, I didn't. They were dogs, dumb as coyotes, I thought. Later in life, I was visiting home for the holiday. All memories of Jalissa long gone by this point. Even in November, my hometown doesn't get much colder than 60 degrees. It's a good place to head to and visit when you want to escape the snow. I didn't expect that my car would break down a quarter mile from my destination. I didn't think I'd end up walking, holding my cell phone above my head just trying to catch a glimmer of a signal. It was broad daylight and the walk wasn't terribly far. I figured that worst case I'd get to my parents' house and have my vehicle towed. Before I made it there, however, the gray dogs appeared. I heard their chattering first, like teenagers giggling under the bleachers. The high-pitched bestial laughter drew my eyes to the sides of the road in the direction of the sound. I spotted their little heads and their long ears sprouting up from behind the hills of rock and foliage. I didn't understand why they were laughing. It was so off-putting because, well, dogs don't laugh. Was it because I was alone? Was it because I'd finally made it all the way back home, right to the place that the dogs were waiting? Was it because of Jalissa? I say that I forgot her, but in reality, I just let her go. I let her drift away when she probably could have used a friend. But you don't think about those things when you're a kid. However, I think that the dogs might now be my karma. But of course, even if they were smarter than coyotes, dogs don't act like that. They aren't vengeful. They just happen to be there. And I just happened to be in their way. They came over the hills suddenly, descending on the road. There were 4 of them. Spines rose from their backs like barbed mohawks. Their eyes were bulbous and as animated as any man's. Their tongues were long and seemed to be prehensile. They curled and coiled in the dry air. Each long tubular tongue seemed to reach for me like an outstretched hand. I ran as quickly as I could. I feared what would happen if those tongues stuck to my body. I'd be covered in the same trinity that decorated Jalissa's notebooks. The 3 puncture marks left by the dogs. A triangular stamp was left in the place where they drained my blood. That's what they wanted, right? That's what it seemed like. They wanted my blood. I ran so fast that I ran straight out of my shoes. I ran until my socks were bloody. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs, and although the distance wasn't very far, I had to push myself to stay out of their reach. The dogs were fast. Even if there were only 4 of them, it felt like one was always at my heels. Another was always closing in at my side. They were surrounding me and urging me to run faster if I really wanted to escape. I did, of course. I crumpled onto my parents' porch and my folks came out yelling louder than I'd ever heard. The dogs scattered. They're fearful like other creatures, I guess. But that doesn't mean they're to be underestimated. We drove together back to my car. As we raised it onto the trailer, the dogs came again. They weren't done with me. There were 3 people this time, though. They couldn't just run into the group and try to get a bite of somebody. Luckily, we had safety in numbers. So they just watched. And they waited. They growled and they snarled, and they drooled thick strands of silvery saliva. They weren't laughing anymore. I'm not sure which sounds I preferred, laughing or the snarling. Both made me very uneasy. It was only on the drive back that I remembered Julissa at all. It all came flooding back, and I remembered growing up with the stories of the dogs. After moving away, those details seemed unimportant, but I should have known better. Now the last thing I'll do is forget those dogs. I've made that mistake once already, but never again. The longer they stay on my mind, the clearer the truth becomes. Of course, they were capable of running a family out of their home. Enough of those dogs seemed that they could do anything. They definitely could strike fear into a number of people. I think those dogs were capable of all those things and more. It was just a matter of crossing their path, of getting in their way when they wanted something. I want to start off by saying that paranormal experiences never happened to me. I had a pretty standard childhood and am currently in my mid-30s. This experience, which happened when I was 25, was my first. For context, I had just graduated college but was having a hard time finding a job in the area I went to school. Eventually, the lease on my apartment ran out, and my parents offered to let me stay with them until I found some work. My parents had moved to a town near my hometown a few years into my college career. They, like many parents, wanted something smaller. One story because my dad has bad knees and just quieter in general. The town they moved to was slightly bigger than my hometown, but he had more in it, so they were close to stores, hospitals, post offices, and all that. Overall, I liked the house. It was cute, small, but fit the way their lives were going. They offered me the second bedroom, which was just being used for storage, and I moved in with a temporary setup. Their bedroom was on the other side of the house with the kitchen and a full bathroom between, so we had some privacy. For the first week, I just hung out with my parents, enjoyed a few home-cooked meals, and took it easy. Eventually, I needed to get to work trying to find a job. I had a laptop, but to give my parents some space, I'd usually head down to the local library and hang out in their community room. I spent a lot of time there the first few weeks just getting my resume up and running, joining job sites, searching, etc. I secured a handful of interviews and was able to spend a little more time at home relaxing before I went to work full-time. The first experience I had was in the middle of the day. I'm a little ashamed to say I was actually taking a nap at the time. My parents were out shopping and I took advantage of a quiet house and passed out. I'm not sure how long it was after dozing off, but I woke up just feeling like someone was in the room with me. At first, I was thinking my mom had come to wake me up. I opened my eyes just a tiny bit, in that half-awake state where your eyes aren't really open, but you can still sort of see what's around you. My room was dark, but something caught my attention. There was a figure standing near my door, and it looked almost beige in color. This made me blink a few times, trying to wake up and understand what I was seeing. Propping myself up on my elbows, I squinted to get a better look. I saw what seemed to be a ghost. I know it sounds strange, but that's the only thing I could think at the time. It looked like a young guy, just standing there, staring off into the room right past me. His form was vague and hazy, and he was varying shades of a soft beige color. I noticed him shifting from foot to foot a little, like he was restless or uncomfortable. Needless to say, I snapped awake, but I was too stunned to say anything or move. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. But even with all this fear and surprise, I didn't get the feeling that this was an evil spirit or anything like that. I held my breath, watching the ghost as closely as I could without moving. Everything in the room seemed to be frozen, like time itself had stopped. After maybe 30 seconds, something incredible happened. The ghost just began to dissipate, slowly fading away. It was like watching fog vanish in the morning sun. I thought about asking my parents about this, but decided not to, knowing I would sound silly and they would think I was just messing with them. For the next few days, I didn't see the ghost again, until one night when I woke up and he was in the same corner. I turned on the light on the nightstand, but he still didn't seem to notice me. This time he stuck around longer, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, before dissipating again. For about 3 weeks I saw the ghost on and off, only ever in the spare bedroom and the same spot. He never spoke, moved, or indicated that he was aware I was in the room, too. About 2 months later, right before I moved out and into an apartment nearby, I casually asked my parents who had owned the house before them. Another couple their age, they told me, with a few kids. I asked if they knew of any accidents, but didn't ask outright about deaths. They definitely picked up on the odd question, and I let it drop. I've never found out why the ghost appeared in that room, and my parents have never brought up seeing him. Part of me thinks because he disappeared for my last few weeks there and I never saw him again, that it was just a random event. Maybe a spirit trapped in a loop that finally got free. At this point, I'll probably never know since it's been so long I feel weird about bringing it up with my parents. They still live there, so maybe they'll catch sight of him one day if he ever comes back. But the experience made me realize that there's a lot more going on around us than we're aware of.